go.
Are we on?
Yep.
So thanks to the miracles of our audio-visual team, we are back after a minor glitch. Thank you to them.
Or a miracle.
Yeah. So we've decided, okay, miracles are not the basis for belief. What was their purpose, if not to serve as a basis for belief? Why were there all these miracles? Again, we're going to look to Maimonides, who writes that all the miracles that Moses performed in the desert were done only for a specific purpose, not in order to bring proof of prophecy. If it was necessary to drown the Egyptians, the sea split and they were swallowed up within it. If we required food, God caused the manna to descend. When they were thirsty, he brought water from the rock. When the group of Korah and his followers rebelled, the earth swallowed them. And so too all of the other signs and wonders. So this was a part of Maimonides that I had never learned, that these miracles were not intended to prove anything. They were, in fact, very practical interventions by God, and miracles generally, when they did occur, occurred in the least miraculous way possible. So if God wanted to achieve something, he could have had, lasers out of the sky and doing all these things. But it was always done, if you look at each of the miracles, it was always done in, there was an earthquake that swallowed them up. There was like some natural answer to it, because it is not God's intent to constantly miraculously intervene in the world. And miracles were not meant for the idea of causing us to believe, but rather they were just simply done for practical purposes. But then we can go back to one of the first miracles that we talked about, which was when God came in the burning bush. And that was a pretty cool miracle, that the bush burned but was not consumed. And I mentioned this briefly, probably outside of the text in probably the first class. But he writes here, the bush may burn, but it will not be consumed. The Jewish people may be in flames, but contrary to the laws of nature, they will never be destroyed. Am Yisrael Chai. The Jewish people will live forever was the metaphorical message that served as the true purpose of the miracle of the burning bush. The burning bush was more than a miracle, it was a message. So why was that miracle done? It was done to send Moses a message that this nation that you're going to be leading will face adversity, but will also survive and will continue and live and prosper. So miracles, therefore, must be rejected as the basis of belief. So why do we believe in Judaism? Why should we accept the words of Moses in the name of God? And how can we be sure his message is truer than that conveyed by countless other prophets and spokesmen? So this is where it becomes new to me when I first learned this. This is a basic religious problem. Why do we believe? To resolve it, the answer of Maimonides, speaking for all the Jewish sages and philosophers, must be understood. And on what basis and this is a quote, and on what basis did the Jewish people believe in Moses? On the basis of what they saw at Har Sinai, standing at Mount Sinai, where our eyes saw and not those of a stranger, where our eyes heard and not those of another. The fire, the sounds, the torches, and he drew near the dense fog, and the voice spoke to him, and we heard. Obviously, I physically was not there. I don't know if any of you were there, but it is our tradition that our spirits were there, our souls were there. But there's more to it than that, because if you're going to say, okay, well, I should believe Moses because you're telling me that my soul was there, a skeptic wouldn't believe that, and I accept that. So Judaism differs from all other religions that begin, and this is most other religions, that begin with one person saying, God told me to tell you. How can we be sure that this is so? How could God ensure that no charlatan or self-deluded Messiah using charm, charisma, or powers of persuasion would speak falsely in his name? By commanding us at the outset to reject every human claim in his name, because God will not entrust something so important as the expression of his will to a messenger who may or may not be lying. This is the distinction. Judaism begins with an experience witnessed by close to 2 million people. And he does the math, 600,000 males between the ages of 20 and 60, plus those that were younger and older, making for a male population of about 1 million and equal number of females for a total of about 2 million people. We heard God speak. We were there. The Midrash teaches us that the souls of future generation were present at Sinai. So I know that may not convince everybody. That would explain why every Jew responds strongly to the message of Sinai. For if the conscious mind does not recall, then what Freud would call the subconscious, what others might refer to as the psychic memory, what we refer to as the neshama, the soul, cannot forget that it too shared the most memorable moment of history as God descended and led an entire people here. I am the Lord your God. So this is not the most, to me, honestly, the most convincing part of the discussion, but it's a foundation of it. And I said we're not going to get into gematria, the numerics, but we are going to get into just a drop of wordplay. We talked before about in Jewish law you need two witnesses, two adim, two witnesses, and that's why we talked in the first class about the two commandments that one was the easiest and one was the hardest, and they both had an equal reward. And one of the reasons there were two is because we rely on the witnesses. Those two commandments are the witnesses that they're all equal and equally rewarded, and that we shouldn't make distinctions between them. Here we're going to go back to that concept of a witness in a little bit of wordplay. Stanton, who I hope is watching on video, his favorite prayer was Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And in the Shema, the last letter of Shema is an ayin, and the last letter of that sentence is Echad. The last letter is a daled. And in the Bible, it is our tradition to write the ayin and the daled enlarged. And that ayin and the daled stand for aid, witness. So the idea of Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad is not just proclaiming God, but it's also saying we were a witness. Our souls, at least, were a witness to that. So he says, let us state it more simply than why this is so important. All religions based on the claim of a person as representative of God face the same dilemma. Same issue. It doesn't matter if it's Jesus or Mormonism or any other religion that may come in the future. And Judaism, same problem. If that person lied, that one person who said God spoke to me and you should be a vegan or whatever it may be, if that person lied, the whole religion is null and void. Now he says the word lied may have many meanings. It may be a conscious distortion of the truth for the sake of personal gain. And he writes, I have known, and this is Rabbi Blech speaking here, I have known at least half a dozen people who think that they are the Messiah, the Son of God. And in one case, God himself. What amazes me is not that people have a capacity for madness, but rather that madness may go in hand with other areas of sanity. All these individuals who claim that they are the Messiah or that they're God, all of these individuals function in society. They are not institutionalized, but they have one area of irrationality. It has become clear to me that people may be self-deluded. Bearing this possibility in mind, Judaism posits that Moses simply come to the Jewish people and said, I have a message from God. He spoke with me and told me the laws to tell you, and you were to observe the following laws. Then the Jewish people would have had every right, and perhaps even the obligation to say to Moses, if God told you, then that's your affair. If you perform miracles, they mean nothing to us. We cannot accept a religion based on a revelation to only one person. So that's where we talk about we were witnesses. But again, I hear you that, okay, you're telling me my soul was there, but there's more. Some might say that the claim of revelation to 2 million is not that significant. Just as other religions fall by the wayside if one person, the source, either lied or was self-deluded, Judaism is not true if the revelation is not true. So if we're saying, okay, well, there was revelation, so I believe, that's like Jesus coming and saying, God spoke to me. Judaism is not true if revelation is not true, or if 2 million people created an imaginary tale for generations. So, there's not much dispute that we all got this Torah from previous generations. Now, just at the small synagogue here, there are people that daven in the Ashkenazic tradition. There are people pray in the Sephardic tradition. There are people that pray by a Chabad style. There are lots of different customs. The Torah, which was kind of like the first of what led to these prayers, we cite the Torah in the prayers, all of these very different styles of prayer, they're actually not that different, but there are differences, key differences. They all cite the same Torah. So the Jews were spread out in the Sephardic area in Spain and areas around there. They were in Europe and Ashkenazic Jews. We've always had Jews living in Israel. We have broad traditions, but they all trace their way back to the one Torah. And the tradition of a Sephardic Jew or an Ashkenazic Jew or a Lubavitch Jew or an Ethiopian Jew or a Jew from any other place, while their interpretations and their songs may be different, we're all singing from the same book. And to say that these 2 million people that were over time dispersed all were able to stick to the same story, where they didn't have a website to say, hey, okay, the Ashkenazic and the Sephardic, we're all going to keep, Shema Yisrael, we're all going to stick to that story, right? They didn't have means of communication. We all had the same playbook, the Torah. Even in our dispersal, even in our different traditions and styles, and the Talmudic interpretations are all different. The source for all of them is exactly the same. The Torah in the synagogue in Portugal and the Torah for the synagogue in Jerusalem and the one in New York and then the one in Park City are exactly the same to the letter. There have been some arguments about how we pronounce the words, but the book is the same, regardless of where it came from. So there's a little bit of math. Again, we're not going to do the gematria, but just to give us a little bit of context for that. Other faiths never claimed corroboration of revelation by even one witness, right? It was Jesus or it was Joseph Smith. It was always one person. How long ago was Sinai? People often exaggerate the time period of when we, in our tradition, received the Torah. If one considers the generations involved, the 3,200 years, that's how long it's been, or 3,225 since this book was written maybe, requires only 80 generations or transmission periods of 40 years each, right? So 80 times 40 would be 3,200 when this book was written. That means there were only 80 parent-to-child eras in which the accounts of Sinai was described and transmitted. That transmission, going on 80 generations in different places, has never varied. Imagine so large a number of people describing an event told to them by their forebears. To challenge the truth of that claim is to say that 2 million people at Sinai or at some later time suddenly came together to fashion one great lie, a lie of an event that they were able to piece together in such a manner that no one's telling of it differed from that of another. That would indeed have been the greatest miracle. A lot of people are watching tonight's class on the video. We had 10 inches of snow overnight. We had probably another 10 today. I skied with Steve. We met up for dinner before class, and his story of what happened today was totally different from my story today, right? How can you go back to 80 generations and all of those transmissions were exactly the same in terms of what the Bible is? That we all stuck to the same story without a means of technology. If Steve and I can't stick to the same story in one day, how can 80 generations pass it along in different parts of the world and still have the same exact book that it's based upon? That talks about the revelation, that these 2 million people were there and they told their children about it and their children told their children about it. And despite the Holocaust and all of the Spanish Inquisition going back in time, we kept that tradition alive. Now, there was a time in the year 300, you'll recall from an earlier class, when the oral tradition was at risk of being lost And that oral tradition, the Mishnah, was then transcribed by Judah Hanasi. So we did things to keep it alive, and we were dispersed. And there's we talked about 2 weeks ago, there's the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, and they disagree on things. But they're not disagreeing on the text, they're disagreeing on the interpretation of the text. And that's critical because those 2 million people passed it along for over 80 generations now, the same exact story. And that is pretty hard to comprehend, that they were sophisticated enough, again, without the internet or cell phones or printing presses or whatever technology over time we've had, they were all able to tell that same story. I'm not saying there weren't disagreements over that story, but it was all based on the same thing. And that is fundamentally the basis of our faith, is that we all got this tradition passed on from generation to generation. There are times that it may have skipped a generation, as we talked about at the very beginning of the book. After the Holocaust, there were some people who went away from the religion. But the children or the grandchildren or the great-grandchildren have begun coming back, which is why this book was written, to educate them. But they don't have to go back very far, and they can go to a cousin or, not straight up that tree for a few generations. It still sticks. That story is still the same. So our analysis has convinced us that Revelation is the only valid source for acceptance of religion. We believe because we heard with our own ears. I understand the problem with that. We do because God commanded us. That equation requires God to perform a revelation incorporating two distinct elements. Jews must believe, number one, in his existence, right? We've established that. We must also commit ourselves to follow his commandments. To accomplish the first, it would have been sufficient for us to have simply heard God proclaim his presence. Jews would have left Sinai knowing that God is. They would have been confident that they had been chosen for divine closeness in some special mission. But what was that mission to be? If they would if they would then have had to rely on the words of Moses as their sole intermediary between themselves and God, the commitment would have been lacking. We didn't hear it from God himself. So God exists, and now Moses, again, is the one person who heard all of this. And that gets to the heart of the issue of tonight's class, is why do we have the 10 Commandments? If they're may be misinterpreted, we may think they're 10 Commandments. Why do we have these Aseret HaDibros, those 10 utterances? Because it wasn't enough for us to see that there was God and then have to rely on Moses saying it. God needed a way to tell us, here's what I want you to do. And the Jewish people, as we learned, were not capable of being in the presence of God. It was too much. So the 10 Commandments come in. Again, we learned that the 10 Commandments aren't 10 Commandments, but they're 10 principles that all of the other 603 other commandments fall under. So what God did was he gave us the 10 Commandments as principles for the rest. And you guys can figure out, based on what I'm telling Moses, that we didn't hear directly all 613 of them. So the way he puts it here, God was, so to speak, faced with a quandary, how to meet with the Jewish people for a short period of time and still ensure that after this encounter, they would know that everything Moses had said in his name really came from him. The solution was the Aseret HaDibros, the Decalogue, expressing those principles. They would be certain issued directly from God. And whenever Moses would teach the Jewish people a new law, one of beyond the 10, he would explain it as a clear and logical extension of the concepts that had originally been proclaimed in Sinai by the Almighty himself. So going back to last week's class, I think it was last week's, where we said there was the law of Shabbat in the 10 Commandments. And that law of Shabbat, which is an important one, it's in the 10 Commandments, is actually a principle that God exists not only in space, but in time. And all of the other holidays that are time-related fall under the principle of Shabbat. So we got the 10 Commandments, we got Shabbat. We didn't just get Shabbat, we got the idea of God being in time. And therefore we can understand, consistent with that, all of the other time-related commandments. So he says the 10 Commandments, were therefore not a pleasant way of introducing the Jews to some laws. Instead, they would serve for all time as the ultimate proof of divine revelation for every single mitzvah, which, if understood correctly, is a logical derivative of what was stated by God for all. Understanding this idea is to know why the 10 categories or principles had to be given, and why the 10 had to summarize the 613 mitzvot. When God wrote the 10 on the tablets, he was conveying the unity of the Torah. When God uttered, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, the 172 words simultaneously, although they were incomprehensible, they achieved freedom from the limitations of sequence, right? Because you could say, well, there are 10 commandments. The first one must be more important than the second one. The second more important than the third. By saying them all at once, there's no sequence to this. In that way, God let us know for all time that not only were all the laws of the Torah divine, they were also indivisible. So that's the end of this first section of the book. But for those that are watching online especially, or haven't been here to all the classes are going to be on YouTube. We'll put them on the Facebook page. We're going to go into the second chapter. And as you know, I like the myth busting. The second chapter, or the part 3, or the next chapter, chapters 6 through 9, are about exceptions. Now, a few weeks ago, I ran into some trouble because I didn't read the whole book at first to refresh myself. And we talked about the Israeli soldiers are fighting to save hostages, to release hostages. And taking hostages out is a mitzvah. It's a commandment in the Torah, is to free people that are held captive. So we said in that class a few weeks ago is that they left in the middle of the holiday of Simchat Torah, Shmini Atzeres, which are celebrated together in Israel, to go save people. Now, when they're doing that job, they don't have to pray mincha. They don't have to pray the afternoon prayer. They don't have to do certain things because, as we learned, if you're currently engaged in a commandment, who is it for us? Who are we to interpret this one's more important than another? I'm going to stop this one and do that one. We don't do that. But then I fell into a logical trap. They stopped doing the holiday, serving God, to go rescue hostages. And we had just learned that it was a holiday. They were serving God. Should they have done that? So we're going to get into those.
One thing at a time, right?
What?
One thing at a time.
Yeah.
Finish.
Yeah. So there's an answer to that question that I didn't have a few weeks ago that is in next week's class. And we're going to get into lots of myth busting and lots of exceptions to rules that I think will be fun to learn. So I hope you can join us. Thank you.
Finished?